Good morning, everyone. First off, thanks, Michelle, Liz, and Sydney Southeast Asia Center for inviting me to provide an update on Malaysian politics. Okay, let me just start with the outline of the presentation today. So basically, the past 2 years in Malaysia have been quite tumultuous politically. As you know, maybe some of you have been keeping up with the news coming from Malaysia. So the talk basically will start from March 2020, which also coincided with the start of the the global pandemic. So which actually makes it even worse politically. Actually, it contributes to the worsening of the politics in Malaysia. So the first part of the presentation will talk a little bit on the return of the ethno-religious political parties that somehow managed to gain power through backdoor dealings and at the expense of a democratically elected PH government. So as some of you might know, in 2018, Malaysia made history by, for the first time, toppling a long entrenched BN UMNO government that had ruled Malaysia for more than 6 decades. So it was unprecedented in Malaysian modern history, but unfortunately, the government, the democratically elected government, only lasted for 22 months. So before, as I mentioned, the backroom dealings and also defections saw an end to it. So, and what had resulted is the instability and fragmentations within the between the political parties and also within the political parties themselves. And then in addition to the battling the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, so it was quite a trying time in Malaysia. But on the other hand, you know, the instability and fragmentation resulted in a competitive political field. It spawned new political parties that managed to compete in several state elections recently. But these state elections also saw voters being fatigued and disillusioned, and you can say apathetic as well. So which evidenced by the low percentage of turnout in these state elections. But these state elections also saw the resurrection of BN UMNO, which were ousted in 2018 and now managed to come back, a political comeback, and making strong claims to regain the federal government. And finally, the presentation will end with a discussion on the future of coalitional politics and also the outlook for the upcoming general elections, which will be slated to be held sometime this year, so as early as August this year. So without further ado, I will go on to the first slide, the presentation. So as I mentioned before, the experiment with the new government, the PH government, that was then the opposition that then managed to take over the federal government, only lasted for 22 months. So the PH government was undone by backdoor bargaining dealings, you know, which is called the Sheraton move, It took place at the Sheraton Hotel at the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. So it's a bargaining carried out by the opposition at the time, and also some defectors from the government, so which ultimately led to the downfall of the PH government. So what happened is and it ushered in a new government, which is called Perikatan Nasional, or PN, which is predominantly Malay Muslim, consisted of the Malay Nationalist Party UMNO, which had ruled Malaysia since independence, and then PAS, which is the Islamist Party, and also Bersatu, which is also a Malay Nationalist Party. So and as soon as this new government took over, there were numerous party hopping that took place at the federal and the state levels. So basically, there were politicians, MPs, and state legislators that jumped from one party to the other, and which resulted in the state legislatures being disbanded, and also and led to fresh elections, which is then which actually see that the takeover of the government not only happened at the federal level but also at the state level. So several states actually fell into PN. So states that were before held by PH, so now because of the defections and party hopping, and then it fell to PN. So and then another thing that happened, not surprisingly actually, the disappearance of ethno-religious controversies. You know, during the PH 22-month of governance, the ethno-religious issues were seen as the Achilles heel for the PH government, you know, because it is a coalition that is multiracial, multi-religious, and then seen as being weak on ethno-religious issue, namely by not protecting the Malay Islam supremacy in Malaysia, and it was duly exploited by the opposition then. So now this opposition had gained power, so suddenly these ethno-religious controversies simply disappeared. Okay. So what characterized, you know, these past 2 years in Malaysia is instability and fragmentation. So, and we can see this happening on both sides, you know, the government and also the opposition. So for this, I will talk about both. So I will start with the government side. So the government is basically made up by these three main component parties, and also including a coalition from Borneo, Eastern Malaysia, but focusing on West Malaysia or the Peninsula Malaysia for this presentation. So so you have the coalition, the BN coalition, which had ruled Malaysia for more than 6 decades. And now they're back in government, but not by themselves. But they're also joining forces with Bersatu and also PAS, and form this new government called PN for the past 2 years. And BN actually, especially UMNO, plays quite a how would say an interesting role here, because on one hand, it is part of the government, but you know, on the other hand, it is also plays the role of opposition. So it seems to have its feet on both sides, right? So, and this is mainly due to the Quad cluster within UMNO. So, as you know, we all might be aware, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, he had been charged and actually convicted in court for corruption cases and also for money laundering. And he was recently sentenced to 12 years in prison, which he is appealing right now. And also his former deputy prime minister, Zahid Hamidi, is currently facing 47 charges for corruption and also money laundering. So these two and also a few other UMNO leaders are facing court charges, and this whole group is dubbed as the court cluster. So they're the ones who playing the quote-unquote opposition role within this government. While there are also other UMNO leaders who are part of the current government. So there are two sides that exist within UMNO at this time. So you can see that kind of fragmentation within UMNO. And the problem is that there is no unity within UMNO itself, because people like Najib Razak, and also Zahid Hamidi, they are powerful, how should I say, warlords, I guess, within the party, so they're a major source of patronage. I mean, they still wield significant influence within the party. So that makes them immovable, yeah. So and allow them to play the troublemaker role. And also, these three parties are Malay, comprised of Malay Muslim memberships, right? And then they're also competing for the same constituency, right? The same Malay majority constituencies, the same Malay votes, yeah. So and this has created a lot of frictions within these political parties, because it's one thing to come together in a coalition, but it's a whole different thing to agree on seat negotiation, for example, which party gets to compete in what constituency, what Malay majority constituency. So we can see that already happening now, and it will become more contentious as the election nearing soon. So and you can see here Bersatu and PAS compete, but in the case of Bersatu, it has very minimal grassroots mobilization and support, because Bersatu spawned off from UMNO. So they basically comes from the same DNA. But in this case, UMNO has the advantage because it has been around longer and it has set roots deep in the society. And then in the case of PAS, it remains a provincial Islamist party with strongholds predominantly in the northeast and the northern part of Malaysia, with almost no relevance in other parts of Malaysia. So, which they actually do want to compete in. But as you can see, as I mentioned before, the seat negotiations between these three political parties that vie for the same Malay votes can be disagreeable and might not come to any kind of compromise. And then there's also instability and fragmentation within the opposition. So I guess the frustrating part of it is, is the inability of the opposition to take advantage of the instability and fragmentation that are happening within the government. So it seems like they also face similar issues, right? So for PH, Pakatan Harapan, which consists of mainly of these three political parties, DAP, which is predominantly Chinese or non-Muslims, non-Malays, and PKR, and then Amanah, which is Islamist party. So PKR and by extension PH is still led by Anwar, despite numerous losses. So there's a stagnancy in the leadership of PH. it's the case of the same old, right? So there is no succession plan. There is no really young leaders groomed to take over the leadership at the top. So that has always been the case. And there's no sign that Anwar will step down anytime soon, even though he's 75 years old this year. And also, as evidence from the recent state elections, the PH can no longer rely on non-Malay voting bloc. So what made them successful in the at least in the past two general election are the overwhelming support they received from the non-Malay voters. So 95% of Chinese Chinese voters support PH, and more than 75% of Indian voters support PH. But in these two recent state elections, you can see those numbers are no longer dependable. So there's also, you can see it's many non-Malays actually started to support BN UMNO. And then also there's MUDA, which is the youth party of young people, which is established by a young MP named Syed Saddiq. But thank you. So this party has little to none grassroots support and mainly urban based. So they managed to compete in the recent state election in Johor, and then but managed to win one seat, which is actually quite commendable for a newly established party. And also Pejuang. So this is Mahathir's new political vehicle. And so, so far it hasn't shown any promise, and it lost badly in the recent state elections. So it doesn't look like it's a viable political vehicle for Mahathir, the former prime minister. And finally, Warisan, which is a Borneo party that is actually trying to compete in the Peninsula Malaysia, but also not showing much success. Yeah, so in the recent state election in Johor, they actually lost quite bad. And finally, we move on to the competitive electoral field and dissolution voters. So there are these two state elections that took place in recent months. You can see there are a lot of parties that competed in this election, but the result overwhelmingly in favor of BN UMNO. As you can see, it won 75% of the total seats in the Malacca state election and 71% in the Johor state election, and the rest of the party not doing very well at all. And then you can see that the voters turnout is also quite low. I mean, it's a sign that voters are tired of all this political drama that has been happening in the past 2 years, and decided not to show up. And in the case of Johor state election, they were banking on new young voters, because Malaysia passed a law to lower voting age from 21 to 18. So Johor state election was the first time these new young voters get to exercise their rights to vote. But most of them decided to sit this one out, which is also, I think, evidence of fatigue and also disillusionment. And we can see from the results of the state election, the BN UMNO is making a comeback. So it seems like all the signs are pointing towards the country is going back to the pre-2018 political status quo, which UMNO acts as a primus inter pares, the first among equals within the BN coalition, and then which then leaves Bersatu to ponder its fate, right? Because Bersatu has lost quite badly in the state elections. And as I mentioned, because Bersatu and UMNO share the same political DNA, so there is a high likelihood that Bersatu members will return back to UMNO. So, and then of course the dropping charges on the Quad cluster. If BN UMNO comes to power and regain the federal government, there's also a strong chance that charges will be dropped on the Quad cluster, on particularly Najib and Zahid, the two men laughing in this picture. And finally, the future coalition politics and outlook for upcoming general elections. So BN with majority, it's hard for BN to win by itself. It needs to get support mainly from Borneo parties. So which might happen, which is the same formula they've used for decades. So an alliance of convenience, that's another question as well, because there have been some talks about how PH and the PN government wanting to work together to stop UMNO. And also it might be Anwar's last chance at being the prime minister as well. And then NO Bersatu, as I mentioned before, and Borneo parties as kingmaker if they work with BN UMNO, and then also the young voters, and then also the decreasing reliability of non-Malay voting bloc, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, with that, I'd like to end this presentation. Again, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to the fruitful discussion in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Azmil. And we've got time for a couple of questions if there are any from the audience. And are we taking questions on Facebook as well? No, okay. If there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand.
Azmil, Michelle here. Could you talk a little bit more about the mobilisation of youth voters, like what strategies were used, and who was using them?
The mobilization of voters, you mean the
young voters?
Mobilization of young voters.
Oh, mobilization of young voters. Okay, yeah, I think we can see at least from the recent state election, especially in Johor, where the young voters get to vote for the first time, the 18 to 21, especially. We can see the issues that mostly concern young voters are bread and butter issues, because you can see how the PH, the opposition campaign in Johor, basically using the same campaign materials from 2018, harping on corruption and kleptocracy and all these things, which didn't really gain much traction with the voters. And BN, on the other hand, BN UMNO actually focused more on bread and butter issue, kitchen table issues, issues that concern young people, especially in the past 2 years, where everyone, not just in Malaysia, but the whole world, facing the economic fallout, unemployment, and all these things, right? So bleak job prospect. So these are the issues that BN and UMNO has been focusing on. And it worked. As you can see from the results of the election, they won overwhelmingly. So I think these are the issues that can be used to mobilize young voters, because we can see there is this anxiety, especially amongst the young people, what's happening now, and then as the country slowly recovers from the fallout from the pandemic.
Thanks, Azmil. Are there any other questions? If not, I might. Oh, thank you, Kim. Can you hear the questions when they're read out, Azmil, or do you need me to repeat them?
I cannot hear anything, actually.
Right.
Can you repeat the question?
Can you hear me, Azmil? Hi, Azmil.
Hi, who's this?
That's Kian Wong.
Oh, hey, Kian, hi.
I won't ask you about our sensitive issues, but anyway. I was curious, could you explain a bit more about the civil society actors and the institutional damage, like the assaults on the judiciary that are now reviving again, and what the implications are, leading towards what will be considered a very contentious federal elections this year.
Mhm. Okay. I can hear Kian's question, actually. So you don't have to repeat back this. Yeah, I think I didn't mention the role of civil society in my presentation because I'm mostly focusing on the political parties. But yeah, I think the pandemic for the past 2 years has somewhat um, hampered the efforts of civil society to do more mobilization and more direct action, because of all the restrictions, right? The imposed on the people. So, but now you can see the civil society groups have started to mobilize, especially knowing that the general election is nearing, is coming soon. So, for example, the civil society group Aliran, which is one of the oldest civil society group in Penang, based in Penang, which I'm also a member of. Also, we come up with a 5-point statement, like a manifesto, and signed by dozens of other civil society groups in Malaysia, outlining basically what the civil society groups want to happen in Malaysia, what the political parties need to do, in order to respond to the needs of the people. So which includes all the, not just the economic issues, but also, in terms of ethno-religious tensions that we're seeing, and all these things, respect for human rights and diversity, and all the things, right? And then minority rights. So we can see and also BERSE, which is also another coalition of civil society groups that advocating for electoral reforms, are also coming up with its own statement as well, or manifesto, so because now the eyes are all focusing on the upcoming general elections. So now, because the society, the Malaysia is opening up now, so there's a bit more space and a bit more freedom to mobilize and to hold public forums, for example, and things like that, even to go out to the streets to protest, so there are all these mobilizations are going on right now. So we can see a lot more of it in the coming months.